think everybody will be expecting. So just I first came across Anita's work 2011 when she showed corrections and clarifications at Kunstwerke in Berlin. And the edition that she showed there is also one of the previous editions of corrections and clarifications that you find here on the wall. And then a year later, I think it was in 2012 in Tech Today, Anita had her table right next to ours from the Green Box Publishing House at the Newsprint Art Book Fair, which was part of Art Berlin Contemporary. So I was super happy to meet Anita in person then and to kind of learn and get to know more about corrections and clarifications, where she also showed previous editions. For me, corrections and clarifications continues to be an amazing kind of investigation and read, offering a parallel, if not reverse view on what is happening in the world. The collected entries range from banal to bizarre, from entertaining to upsetting, from mere facts to pure poetry, while at the same time exposing our biases and our blind spots. To name just a few that you find here in the newspaper and in the book, of course. And this is almost a random pick, they're also right. September 24th. An article on Tuesday about the Portland protests moving into suburb neighborhoods referred incorrectly to Jessie Berkey, a business owner in Portland. She is a woman. I think something that is also happening again and again. July 22nd. The word "by" was regrettably missing from an image caption in the article inside the dissident Irish base. The text should have said, "The journalist Lyra McKee killed by a new IRA gunman in Derry in 2019. Not killed a, little mistakes. And on a lighter note, for the German speaker, September 23rd, im Beitrag "Beim Meckern ganz alleine" wurde der Kurzohr-Rüsselspringer fälschlicherweise den Mäusen zugerechnet. Er wird zwar auch als Kurzohr-Elefantenspitzmaus bezeichnet und hat eine Ähnlichkeit mit den Mäusen, ist aber systematisch keine. Der Kurzohr-Rüsselspringer gehört zu den Afrotheria und damit in die afrikanische Verwandtschaft von Tieren wie dem Elefanten, der Seekuh oder dem Erdferkel. January 10th. Vagina and vulva were both used to describe a sculpture in the article, "Giant Vagina Triggers Fury, Bolsonaro's Divided Brazil." Only vulva was correct. Needless to say, I had to Google that immediately. But before I get carried away reading even more, and I literally, once you start, it's like kind of takes you from one to the next. I want to introduce Anna Bromley and Florian Wüst, who are here tonight in conversation with Anita Di Bianco. Anna Bromley, jet lagged as she just returned from Siberia, studied political science at Humboldt University in Berlin and art at the Bremen and Hamburg Universities of Fine Arts. Her work has been shown most recently at Boys 2021, at Documenta 14 in Kassel, at the Architecture Biennial in Tbilisi, as well as NDBK, Haus der Kultur und der Welt, and Semi Contemporary in Berlin. Since 2020, she is a fellow at the Academy of Media Arts in Cologne. Florian Wüst is a Berlin-based film curator, artist, and publisher. From 2016 to 2020, he was the film and video curator of Transmediale. He is co-founder of the Berlin Journals, an ongoing series of publications that address the social, cultural, and economic changes in Berlin and other cities. Thank you so much for being here tonight. Anna Bromley and Florian Wüst have also contributed to the book "The Error is Regretted. Wir entschuldigen uns für diesen Fehler", that is released tonight and that you can see here on the table. And so just for you to understand, there's on one hand the newspaper, which is the new edition of Corrections and Clarifications. And the 20th anniversary now also comes with this newspaper and added articles and interviews also with Florian and Anna here in this kind of hardcover version as a book. There's also one copy up there if you want. During the exhibition, or especially tonight, it's actually, we offer it at a special price of €25 the book, instead of 29, I think, which is the regular price. If you want a copy, there is Eva and Lisa in the back who will also be at the bar afterwards, so you can go to them if you're interested. And at this point, I also want to thank Eva Dumoulin, Lisa Böcklin, Jens and Finn Bauermeister for their help and support in making this exhibition. And also thank you to Stiftung Kunstfonds who supported the exhibition and the book. And after the talk, as always, you're welcome to stay, have a glass of wine, mingle, and also feel free. These are actually for free. There's this pile here in the back. You're welcome to take a free copy of the brand new, hot off the press issue of Corrections and Clarifications. Yeah. So, over to you.
Thank you, Anja. I thank you all for coming, and big thank you to Anja, the Green Box, and A to Z for this collaboration on the book, which has been a pleasure, and which actually started from a phone conversation with Anja maybe a year and a half ago, and I'm so pleased to finally see the book today for the first time. I was thinking of all different ways to start this talk, because I have a bad habit of kind of jumping in and not explaining what the project is or how it started, or and I was trying to sort of figure out why that was, and I can only think that it's because I have a kind of ambivalence about what the project is about. And now that it's something that I started in 2001 in Amsterdam. At that time, I guess I was reading The Guardian every day on paper, as one did 20 years ago. And September 11th happened, and I wasn't in New York, which is my hometown. So I became obsessed with news, and somehow these items in the news. I didn't know what to do with all this news that I was ingesting, and I realized that it was very unhealthy to just ingest news all the time. So somehow the first edition was this little thing, and then over the years, sort of every year I did an edition for a different situation or context, some in different languages, all in different cities, all different lengths, they all look different. There was no kind of unifying aesthetic to them, except that they are following a sort of deconstructed aesthetic of newspapers. And over the years I had different feelings about what the project was about. Is it about truth being impossible or truth being possible? Was the sort of big ambivalence of the whole thing. And is it about believing in language, or is it about the futility of language? And I think 20 years later, I have a much darker view. And I was thinking it's terrible to start off on a really negative note, but I wanted to actually read an item from the first page, because from October 1st, 2021, an article Tuesday about increasing fears among women that the Taliban will restrict their access to education included several comments from an individual claiming to be Mohammed Ashraf Gairat, the newly appointed chancellor of Kabul University, saying that women would not be allowed to go to work or attend classes at the college. The comments included those posted to a Twitter account in Mr. Gairat's name. Multiple calls to the chancellor's office and his top aide for confirmation were turned away, with the aide saying that the chancellor would not speak to the media, and referring questions to a senior Taliban spokesman who did not deny the account's claims. After publication of the article, the authenticity of the account was cast into doubt, and the Times has been unable to reach the university's chancellor to confirm his position on school policies. Parentheses, the digital version of the article and its accompanying headline have been updated to reflect doubts about the social media posts. So yeah, without going too far into a hole, I was thinking that in a way the big problem for me of the language of these items, and the big challenge is the kind of futility of all of this managed information. And that example for me quite succinctly summarizes both this idea that we're looking to news and to social media to get a legitimate and trustworthy account, and the impossibility of that, and that managed information in itself is maybe an impossibility. So I don't want to go too far into that direction, but I also wanted to say that it's not for me this was never a project about fact-checking or about pointing out inaccuracies or about singling out mistakes. Actually, it's, and especially in this edition, maybe it's clear, it's the accumulation of them that, if anything is interesting about it, is the interesting thing. And I wanted to say a little bit about, since the context of this space and of A to Z it's a graphic design space, and this project is also somehow relating to familiar design. Obviously, in its invitation to pick it up is only because it relies on the aesthetic of the newspaper, something that we're all very, very intimate with. And through the years, it has worked in different ways with that aesthetic, and has worked with different pieces of that aesthetic, if not all at the same time. And in a way, my interest in news, and especially in a kind of we could say traditional media, for lack of a better term, started after art school when I worked for TV news in New York, and I worked for the CBS Evening News, which is the national TV broadcast, and I was thinking about this difference between national news broadcasts and local news broadcasts being similar to this difference between local newspapers and national ones, or like that the CBS Evening News is like the FAZ or the Süddeutsche or something in its posturing and in its scope. But in both cases, one is working with a pretty constricted idea of design and what those aesthetics are meant to impart to the viewer. What is meant to get a sense that this aesthetic imparts impartiality and certain gravity, obviously, and as well as these touchier things like patriotism, security, sense of some kind of sense of nationalism, or some kind of sense of belonging, and there's the conflict that is between the local and the national, which now has become a kind of conflict between elite and non-elite. So that is a bit of background about the physicality of the project. I don't want to go on too long before I talk a bit about the contributions of Florian and Anna, and I don't know if either one of you would like to jump in now with something, or if you would like to introduce any questions at this point, or if I should go on and say a bit about your text. Yeah. Okay. So the texts in the center of the book are one of them is to me here. And one thing that she raises early on in the text is the reason that we're reading any of these items in German newspapers is due to the German press codex. And I thought I would just take the opportunity, since I know, I don't know if of the English speakers in the audience, if you know what that is. So I'm just going to read it. I'm just going to read it in English. Which said I think the third part of it says that published news or allegations, especially of a personal nature, which subsequently prove to be false, shall be corrected without delay by the organ of publication which brought them on its own initiative in an appropriate manner. It must be recognizable to the reader that the preceding report was wholly or partly incorrect. Therefore, a correction refers to the preceding false report when reproducing the correct facts. The true facts are described, even if the error has already been admitted to the public in another way. That's a bit of a wonky translation, but it's what it means. In fact, is that in German newspapers, the corrections should be printed where the error was committed, was printed originally, which is not the same in English language papers. And there isn't the same very direct, or there isn't the same directive for UK or US newspapers about how mistakes have to be addressed in print. And I also wanted to, there's a few, for me, very interesting things that Anna raises in her text. And I'm just going to read, quickly quote from your text, Anna. The more pages a newspaper has and the more independent journalistic research it commissions, the greater the likelihood that mistakes will be made. In many countries, the responsible admission and prompt correction of such errors separates the serious press from the tabloid press. With its commitment to media accountability, the West German press once managed to distance itself from the announced control of the Adenauer government. A similar commitment saved the US press from the threat of capture by the Nixon administration. Like a tactical shield, self-regulation secured its independence through media accountability. To this day, debates around this practice activate the self-organization of the industry, and self-organization also means that journalistic knowledge is created in editorial processes. The practices of its knowledge formation also include the correction of news that unintentionally or culpably misrepresents facts, as well as of unconfirmed reports or conjectures. From this point of view, the corrections can be understood as knowledge self-formation, which is carried out by press houses, committed readers, and freelance journalists. So what I find interesting is this idea that knowledge is actually created through these processes. That it's not that the false information somehow appears as true, but that in this struggle between the two things, and in this process that has transformed in recent years by the fact that newspapers have transformed a lot into a lot of freelance labor and many less fact checkers, many less salaried journalists and writers. That this transformation is also a transformation in the creation or struggle of creation of knowledge and facts. And it's also interesting to think about this question of self-regulation and how that, I don't want to go too far into the changes that have happened now that the news is all online, but obviously to ignore that would be absurd. So one interesting thing about online news sources is that there are quite a few that mimic that use like a false name of a newspaper in order to, like, I don't know, instead of the Orlando Sentinel, which is a famous Florida paper, it'll be the Orlando Register with the same font, and that for many viewers who are used to either reading print news or even reading news from a newspaper's website, it looks legitimate and trustworthy but it's borrowing this aesthetic of familiarity of a newspaper that readers know and trust. So maybe this is a good moment. I have a bunch of questions that I sort of wanted to see what you think of, and please, if anyone has questions at any point, please interrupt me. I am sitting here with two people who make a lot of media, actually, and so I don't want to only focus on the critical aspect of this engagement with media, but also the hopeful or potential one, which is that Florian, your work with the Berliner Hefte, and I know your podcasts, I know your texts. I'm wondering if either one of you would like to comment a bit on this question of being an independent producer and how one engages with this authority of the printed or published word, especially now that this is such a volatile area. This question of the authority of facts or of insisting on facts or information as facts. And I don't know if either one of you want to say a bit about how you approach that.
I think it's to Florian, because you have this newspaper project. It's
it's not a newspaper, but we are a series of small publications, as we say, with the Berlin journals on the history and present state of the city, Berliner Hefte zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der Stadt. So it's an ongoing series, and of course maybe there's something related because we have a very reduced aesthetic, I would say, also for pragmatic reasons, only black and white, A5 format, only €7 as a sort of standard price, whatever. However, I mean, it doesn't matter how many pages we publish, it's always the same price. Affordability is very important. And to get to your question, I think about how you relate to the authority of fact or fact-making or false facts or the ambivalence of facts, because often you lack the tools to prove or unprove things. So I think for us it's very a crucial motivation is to look at things that are not necessary in the media or that are not in a more larger narrative, that are missing, blind spots, with a very particular focus on Berlin, its urban history and its urban politics. So in a way it's about an alternative, and that also connects to your article, because quite a good part you relate to the alternative media movement. And in this large succession, in our conversation we came through lots of like historical moments, and what more of an historical moment you can imagine to start this project as 9/11, and there's another, you go back to Seattle and indie media in '99, but just made me also realize that those 20 years or 25 years, all these decisive moments and how the world has changed and what we had also faced in really unthinkable developments, and we're in the middle of another one, and we thought we would be quite at the end of it, and we are still with masks and all that. So it's a long history of very decisive moments, and have a lot to do with our perception of the world and how media is created. And but now I lost my thread to Yeah, so for us, I think it's very important to create your alternative vision to address things that are not necessary, because it's always, I mean, this is so much material in there, but it's only that much, you know, and there's so many stories and so many facts untold, unreflected, and there I see our practice of independent publishing is very important to just take a different voice in there, or one that looks at things in a different way than what's out there. And I'm talking not only about mainstream media, so the whole noise, you know, but there's always something missing. And I think it's always justified that you add something to it and do it thoroughly. So that's why I think, and we are struggling with that a lot. We thought like, oh, sometimes we would just publish something that's more newspaper-like, very instantaneously, spontaneous, and we never manage. We're stuck in rounds of corrections, proofreading, of also fact-checking, of footnotes and all that. So I think it's important to also be serious about what you say and what you publish, because, and that's the great thing about the book format, it stays there. You know, it's not ephemeral. It enters the archive immediately, and you have to live with that. So I think you need to take it serious what you publish, and but that's what drives us and what drives me in regard of writing and publishing. And I think it must drive you as well, because you do this for 20 years. I think it's a monumental art piece in the first place. So.
It's interesting that you say that you want to be in independent media, because that's, you know, something that I try to highlight in my contribution, in my text, that, you know, media considered itself as being independent since the Adenauer-Dixon era, because it's, you know, it had always been not under the control of the state, and when the more conservative turn in policy making tried to like grab after the media, they kind of found this self-organized practice of corrections and clarifications, the press code, and that was, you know, in the English-speaking media of the US, the same as in West Germany. And so, you know, they considered themselves being independent, or it's still being considered as independent. But yet we have the same 10 large newspapers which, you know, tend to cover news in Germany. And it's kind of interesting that, like, you know, you mentioned the media, you also in your conversation mentioned Annie Goodman and the Democracy Now!, which was a very important alternative channel to getting news at first during the Gulf Wars. I remember, I think she also started in the late 90s, if I'm right, as a radio thing on the independent radios in the US, throughout the US, the NPR radio network. So yeah, it's you know, that independent doesn't actually mean anything by itself. You know, independent can mean it's just like a, I don't know, it's like a vessel which can be filled any ways. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily productive or something. And with the recession in the media, it like turned out to, you know, that the knowledge production within journalism was like became so precarious, and that could also be one explanation of, you know, the masses of corrections and clarifications, that there's like just like no time to check facts. But it also says, I think it's also telling about, you know, which people sit in, which people write texts, you know, when they make these grave mistakes sometimes relating to, especially relating to non-Western realities. And that was, for me that kind of stuck out, that, like, wow, amazing, because you can see that there was nobody in the editorial team who said, wait a minute, this is not correct. I mean, it's like obvious, right? And I found it interesting that how in your conversation you mentioned that the Turkish and the Bosnian edition of corrections and clarifications, and how, Anita, you made kind of like this reverse newsroom with people, because you couldn't read the language, you don't know how to speak or how to read the languages in Bosnia and Turkey. And then you had people, telling you, helping you in the editorial process and sorting things out, and you totally relied on them. And that seemed to me like, because you said that you worked in the CBS newsroom, and then you kind of created your own newsroom with people who you felt are reliable. Maybe you want to tell us a bit more about that. That's been such an interesting process.
It is. The edition that we made in Turkey, I think, is interesting because we also, from the beginning, talked to a lawyer, and it was quite complicated to figure out how to do that, and how to. There were a few different people in Istanbul that we spoke to about the process of doing it, the necessity of doing it, what would be the pitfalls, and. The edition is up there. You can't see it. It's in the back on the right one. It's the largest format, and it is very funny to try to get people to explain small linguistic items to you, because you have to. To try to explain, is it ironic, is it insulting, is it, and in what degree, is it vulgar, is it insulting, is it overly personal? Because in my mind, I also have a certain ethics about not printing certain kinds of things that I consider unethical, and I have obviously an arbitrary ethical system myself that is then being kind of superimposed on all the other systems in each of the sources, and it quickly becomes quite absurd. Like, okay, so that's funny, but is it meant to be funny, or is it just funny because we're being inappropriate, or is it funny at someone's expense, and you realize there's a kind of finite number of possibilities of tone, let's say, for these things. But that it's something that you absolutely can't understand in a language that you're not fluent in.
So then you discuss every individual item in that edition with your collaborators. They would really explain it to that depth, that you fully understand it, and then you can make that choice.
I think only the touchy ones.
Okay,
only the touchy ones.
More touchy ones, and then the general tone, your interest, and then they make the selection.
Yeah, and I was thinking that one is also interesting because I think it plays a bit with the tabloid aesthetic, because of the way that it uses images, and the way and that one was distributed around Istanbul in newspaper things, and I think that one was also interesting in terms of the distribution, that how it got back to people, and that it didn't necessarily look like it was speaking to a particular audience, and that's also one of the big things that I think about a lot in terms of small publishing is our how do we understand this dilemma of speaking to a very small audience that is kind of identitarian, and that is somehow self-selecting, and one of the I don't know if he's a sociologist, Oliver Nachwe, that you speak about in your text.
Yeah, Oliver Nachwe.
And I don't know if this is a decent translation of, he talks about restricted solidarity, that in the exclusive solidarity, that somehow as perceptions and resources both shrink, that our solidarity is limited to those that we identify with. And this is an old idea perhaps, but to look at how this functions in the current landscape is quite alarming. And then to me this raises the question about the choosing an aesthetic for a publication, or choosing an approach for something that one publishes. Is there any escape from that? Is there any escape from the vocabulary that one chooses that is immediately recognizable to a certain group and inaccessible to another group, or has very subtle ways of orienting itself toward one particular group? I'm bringing this up because it's quite fundamental as a thread through your text, Anna, and I think it's an unsolvable problem. And I don't know, but I always wonder how to play with that, or perhaps how to turn it over on its head, if that's possible.
Yeah, but as we heard from Anya's introduction, I mean, there's quite a wide range of what you choose. So it's not only having political, or you have items in there, or you need to carry a certain historical knowledge to kind of know how to place it, or also to kind of dismantle it in its absurdity, but also in, as you said, like in maybe the shocking aspect of it, what mistakes, to what extent have been made, and how fatal they might be, in the misreading of them, or the moment, because there's maybe it remains as a big gap. It's published one day, and in the old day, daily newspaper reading, and the next day is the correction, or maybe 2 days later, and you might miss that, and then you just carry on with that false information. And so it's not only that, but you have also very light ones and quite humorous. So in that respect, I understand that it's also time to open it up and possibly have a larger readership that can plug into that. And so I think, and that's what I appreciate about it, there's also a lot of irony and humor in it, in what you choose. And I think that's something catchy about it, that you lure somebody and just sometimes just laugh about what's in there. Because of course it's as absurd as reality is, and so many. But all that also ends up in the newspapers, It's not only the heavy politics and the articles about the state of society. I mean, lots of other things are communicated, discussed every day, written about, and they find the people that are especially interested in those in the miscellaneous page. And you also go through it in order to create each of your editions. Right? So there I think you try to also in a way make it more open and more digestible. So I think that's very important about the project.
I mean, this one particularly has on the back is the list of sources, and I was interested, especially this time, in not narrowing it to one part of this political spectrum of newspapers, because we all know, even from the titles of newspapers that we read or are familiar with what their orientation is. So especially in these last years, I've tried to not narrow it to the ones that I read, and already shrink it to my perspective. I mean, it is always chosen by me, but in this one it was important to me that it's a bit more of a survey and less of a critique, if that makes sense.
But I also read it like that. I read it a bit different than you. I think it's actually quite undigestible. Like, browsing through this text after the second page, you already kind of like, or I was already became kind of like tired. And but what is interesting, I think, is I kind of thought, who writes these texts? And these are all people who have an academic education. So, it kind of narrows it down, what you get to read. And how do you get jobs in the journalist business? Not by applying or, trying to get an apprenticeship or something, but you kind of, like, people hang out in certain bars and cafes and then get to know each other, and that's how you get to write for newspapers and journals. And so I think it is, it has to do a lot with that, what Nachtwey describes, this exclusive solidarity is to see, I can totally read it in that. There is like this narrow scope of what people see, what they are able to see and to articulate in articles due to the social reality that they, live in, or the circles and networks of people they know, whom they get in contact with. And so it's, it's both. It's funny and sad what you can see here. It's not, I don't think it's so humorous to me. It shows like restrictions of, who makes the news and who's able to read. And that's also something that I started off with in my text, right? Reading is not a universal practice. Reading is a social practice. It comes with a certain education, it comes with a certain home that you grow up in, a home which has a newspaper in the first place, right? And the kind of newspapers that was at home when, each of us grew up will kind of direct your future of reading newspapers. I think that's like so hard, that is so deep. It's like a reading subjectivation or something. That, the kind of how you page for newspapers, how you feel with the material, how you feel with size. I think that's kind of important. Like, I described that I always feel a bit uncomfortable with large sizes because my parents had like the tabloid newspapers, which are small sizes. So it's like, I keep kind of feeling clumsy when I open a large newspaper such as Frankfurter Allgemeine or Zeit, Zeit. And I always like spill my coffee. It kind of sticks with me, and I think that's, sounds familiar, right? That's what Bourdieu describes in Define Unterschied, and I think that's still, I can still feel it a lot, like these newspapers touch me, I touch them, they touch me back. It's like this, it's not like something to read, but it also reads me and my body and my habitus and whatever. The people I hang out with.
Can I quote again from your text? I think it's also interesting, Anna talks about sort of what is not there in how items are corrected. And one example is, that the person who corrected the Canadian Prime Minister not being the president doesn't explain that the former British colonies have a certain name for their leaders who are, in the end of the day, subjects of the British Crown. And that, there's all this backstory to a little mistake like that. Is it a prime minister? Is it a president? Is it and that is not, in this terse correction, that whole history is sort of abandoned or not visible. And, Anna sort of asked the question, if I remember correctly, did the writer of that not feel they could account for this whole colonial history? Mm-hmm. Did they not want to? Were they not able to? Did they not see that this was about the colonial history? But there's another item that I just want to quote about this issue of how much is left out in what is corrected. Elsewhere, it is clarified that the former GDR top athlete Katarina Witt, quote, would not have participated in any TV broadcast of the MDR in the blue blouse of the FDJ, the Freie Deutsche Jugend, the communist youth organization.
Yeah.
End of the short correction. What does this tell me? Has Katerina Witt distanced herself from identitarian gestures in the meantime? The correction omits the fact that she advertised the DDR show, I don't know if that's a bad translation, of a private station in the typical Freie Deutsche Jugend blue shirt, whereupon a CDU politician demanded legal consequences. It was serious because the Socialist Youth Organization and the wearing of its bright blue long-sleeve shirt are constitutionally banned in the Federal Republic. So this was this whole quite rich history that I guess your point is it's being, boiled down to to a sentence that sort of course eliminates whatever happened after that and whatever happened before, and that actually each of these things is a quite interesting signifier. And if you ask, what is the meaning of her having not done that at that time? Does it mean she never did it? Does it mean that she won't do it? Does it? And I just found it super interesting. This one kind of symbolic correction.
Yeah, it's actually kind of interesting. Like before you, one of us mentioned the printed newspapers to be, something. I think you said it right, to signify security and belonging, or maybe stability. Even. I thought actually maybe it signifies seriousness, altogether, right? Serious, and he said how he worked in tradition and media, and that it maybe changed with the media being more consumed digitally now. And I just wondered, really, the first time that I thought about it, but because on blogs and maybe also in newspaper blogs, I guess things get corrected without being seen. And here we can see the correction process and read in the correction process if we like to. But online, these editorial performances are not visible anymore, and how creepy that is actually. Because then the editorial team gets even more invisible. Because you talked in your conversation about the invisibility, and I did so too. I think Francesco also mentions that there is this, you have the names of all the writers and of all the commenters who demand a correction, but the editor is only seen in the imprint, and how often do we read the imprint, and how much do we know the names of the editors if they are not people who we deeply find disgusting, then of course.
Well, how often the authors are really pissed at what the editors do to their articles.
Yeah.
So I think it's often a huge gap between what's delivered and what ends up really in the newsprint.
Yeah.
So there's also conflicts on that.
But it's interesting, this distinction between the idea that serious journalism demonstrates its seriousness or earnest quality by saying that it is willing to regulate itself or correct itself. Whereas, the British tabloids have to be, sued to pay their victims to correct it. So, and I think that's a very interesting sorting mechanism when we think about the whole this whole performance of anger and performance of outrage that is everywhere now, and that somehow it is a kind of performance of identity to be assiduously correcting oneself and admitting fault versus taking the opposite position, which is sue me. And it's I guess what I'm interested in is to what extent this is posturing on the part of those, and I think that's what we're one of the big questions is here. Does it help to correct these huge errors, that are sometimes sometimes these massive errors, like one that you raised in our conversation about, I can't remember,
it was about the number of killed Jews in the Second World War in Poland was just reduced by half or so.
So it's, does it have any effect, or is it a demonstration of my good intention that I'm willing to correct it? And of course, as you say, Florian, it's these things fall through the cracks, but they anyway have to be printed, and I think that they do have to be printed, whether I read the paper the next day and read it or not. I agree that they have to be printed. So I suppose I still believe somehow in this whole thing that we're sort of trying to pull apart.
Yeah, I think you're right, and that it's an obligation to some extent. I mean, we don't know what made that, what generated that correction. Was that somebody phoning in, correcting it? Was there a process within the editor, or the author himself discovered it? Was it intentionally put and then they had to change it because somebody was phoning in? I mean, that's all unknown, right? And so I think just as a sort of, to be able to maintain a confidence in a sort of checking or correcting and a process of revision, that this is there, and that we as readers and also newspapers or serious press takes care of it and takes it serious. I think it's important. I think what it now, and I would like to come back also to really talk about what you do, because we're celebrating the 20 years of your corrections and clarifications project. It's just a mere amount of time, and you've been busy with that, and no idea how you do on a daily basis. I mean, you have your newspaper slot every day, how you do that practically, I find it very fascinating. And so all this, that it's so vague and so ambivalent, all this speculation involved, which is just naturally about anything you feel like that gets to you as an information, your view on the world, what I say, what do you actually understand? What do you hear when I talk to you? So in human communication, there's so much speculation and the very base involved. And you're eagerly busy every day and for centuries to create a sort of objective, universal base on this we can understand each other, and to this we rely, that's the rule, that's the norm. And I think you perfectly, in the form you found, by just, without commenting, putting these together in these huge compilations, and I think it's very crucial, or you don't need to read it, of course, from A to Z, from first page, it's impossible. I mean, it's something that is like, a lot of value is there just in the mere fact of having it collected, and it's there, and you can go in and out of it, you can read it all through, and I think that constitutes what it's about. And and in the items itself, I find it so fascinating because they always refer to something that's not there. They refer to the article of the day before. So you need to, as a reader, constantly also speculate on what's actually going on there, or what was then, when it's not, because many are more unclear. Some are really about numbers. Okay, that's the right number in opposition to the wrong one we had printed, but some, like, you're also then lost in interpretation maybe of these items. So there's lots of playful, and maybe that's the humoristic part of it. It's very playful. So I said in our conversation, it's this, you operate with this on this threshold between a critical analysis, which is also in there, and the playful appropriation. And you also the invisible editor in here. It's a very subjective choice of things. It's not an absolute number of corrections. I mean, you made your choice and you construct the narratives and you play also with what you put were and so on. And that's, I think it's really an artistic project, but which manages to yeah, to really sharpen a critical view on that situation of human communication and of media production. And yeah, I'm just really, it's amazing that you did that for 20 years. I just can't repeat it again and again.
I think it was a project that I think of it more of as a compulsion.
It's something
or
absolutely compulsive, obvious.
Yeah. And it's definitely something that I never thought would be of interest to anyone else. Because it's you know, because that is another thing you have as an artist, or like the things that you think are interesting to you that you assume will only be of interest to you. And you know, this particular edition, I found it quite heartbreaking when I was done with it, because as I look back, it starts in June, early June 2020. So it's I think a week after George Floyd was killed by police, and then it ends right after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so it kind of trudges through everything we've all, you know, experienced. In of course, in that it's pressed from different parts of the world, and so from, you know, large stories to small stories. But it's repeating a lot of themes over and over according to kind of how big these things were in news. And by the end of it, I sort of felt, yeah, okay, so this thing we heard about for 3 weeks, and then this for 2. It sort of reduced everything to a very distressing and in some sense, because these items are referring to these huge stories, it's this little manageable thing that is referring to things that are completely unmanageable, you know?
Yeah.
And every time I sort of try to get my head around what is the meaning of collecting these things, I sort of throw my hands up and decide that it's a I don't know, driven behavior, as we said, or you know, it's just something that you don't stop yourself from doing because you assume that the accumulation will build something, or that stopping will be harmful.
So how do you do it?
Well,
That's the secret.
I mean, I do it all with databases. I must admit that I don't do it with paper as I did originally. But it's its own kind of thing, because insofar as I was trying really with this one not to have a biased constricted range of papers that were all, I don't know, center, left, whatever. I sort of go down these certain kinds of rabbit holes to figure out what kind of sources they are. And there's a lot of unreliable items in here that obviously are correcting completely false news stories that are nevertheless printed and published. And so with this one, it's certainly taking on this problem we have now that presenting information as facts is already a divisive thing to do. You know, and that we have this very unsure terrain that of what it means to insist that something is a fact, and what group that puts you in, which sounds totally absurd. Actually,
Just one, I mean, what do you mean with databases? I mean, is that like the websites of those individual newspapers here and publishers, or
no, it's
or
actually
is there
just academic databases actually that conglomerate news sites. So it's not actually the paper itself. that these are all collected.
And they collect the news plus the correction.
Yeah,
And there you can find it.
yeah.
Have you,
You make a set, sorry.
I was just going to ask, has your sense of belonging to the sense of correction changed over the last 20 years? So when you came across the corrections first, did you feel that there was something meaningful in the corrections? And has that altered since in the last 20 years? The meaningfulness of the corrections that you're coming upon now?
I think that in 2001, I had the feeling that, and I guess media critique was a different thing then, that I was picking on institutions that needed to be picked on, and things that we trusted too much, and especially in that 2001 to 2003, between September 11th and the Iraq War, that turned out, at least with regard to like the U.S. news, to be very true. That the New York Times went right along with all the lies that led to the Iraq War. So at the beginning, it certainly was this like picking away at something that I thought we shouldn't trust as much as we do, and now it's a kind of, you know, it is a beleaguered industry for many reasons now, obviously, both good and bad, and perhaps our whatever I'm saying, I mean, R is a very illogical way to say it, but perhaps the trust then was as misplaced as it would be now. It's not that maybe there wasn't more to trust 20 years ago in this type of news. But yeah, I certainly can feel like it's less. I'm on less solid ground in a way now that I'm kind of picking on underpaid freelance journalists who no longer have salary jobs at newspapers.
So there's a fluidity in what you're trying to pick on that's much, much greater than was previous?
I would say,
Yeah.
yeah. Which is probably why I started this whole thing with my ambivalence, because I also feel that the pleasure that one takes in these, or the conclusions that one is drawing, is certainly at the expense of someone's labor, and that's not a reconcilable problem.
But you move always in the language space that you are in, right? Like here's like American, like English speaking and German speaking. And I just wondered, did you never felt like it would be interesting to connect to the Turkish news coverage or the Bosnian news coverage, which you like had in former newspapers, or like other regions?
No, absolutely. It just depends on that creating that situation where I can spend a lot of time with someone who can explain the news environment and landscape, and that we can kind of work on something that is meaningful at that,
Yeah.
and that I can understand.
Yeah.
That's my limitation, really. But it would be super interesting to come back to circle back to one.
No, I just also wondered if that, kind of, we can follow your like actual movements of your body through the world when we like have the Turkish edition or the Bosnian edition, and now there's like, because I know you've been to the US meanwhile, and this to me seemed like, okay, you've been in Frankfurt or in New York, and you kind of somehow read it through it also, the way you've been.
Yeah, I guess it's still on a human scale. It's still a visible map in a way. I don't erase my tracks, even if I try.
Because there are also like English-speaking newspapers in Israel or in some Arabian countries, I think. Yeah.
How do you select? I was wondering, are there clarifications and corrections you come across that you say, no, I'm not going to put this in? Is it really like an overview of as much as you can find?
I generally focus on politics and culture probably, and I think the things that I avoid are just if I had my sense is that the original article was exploitive, and that the correction is also, and that's obviously my own definition of what that means and where I draw my line. That's mostly an issue probably with the British papers, because there are many items that, I mean, they also try to be funny with it, but it's often a very, really at the expense of something that's been exposed that shouldn't have been exposed. That I think, so yeah, that is just my ethics of the whole thing but no, there are some pretty painful things to read in here, and that I think, I guess the U.S. papers will mention people's names in cases where a German newspaper wouldn't, and I struggled a bit with whether I should reprint someone's name or not, and that I don't know the answer to.
I always want to say something that deeply visible, that you're a visual artist. Like in that project, besides language, besides politics, besides that, it's kind of it starts in a huge visual act of destruction and followed by distrust. Destruction and distrust is basically almost in a sculptural way, not sculpting away, but adding these arrows. And then it's finite, it's the disappearance of the printed newspaper. So it's an act of destruction into its disappearance, memorized through errors, then you accumulate. And I think this is a very sculptural gesture. And within that, and here we can talk about other things, but there's this very button, then it disappears. In this disappearance, accumulation of errors. I find this a very condensed form of memorizing a disappearance through error. I find it amazing. And I think in that sense, what I meant before when I talked about Hannah Arendt is also that why the book is so crucial. The difference between the book and the newspaper is almost as if it would be two different things. What you meant also, the thing of something that is permanent, it claims permanence. Whereas the printing them as newspapers goes into leaves it in between the newspaper and being a non-newspaper. The newspaper represented through itself in the form of its error. And making it a book is this and its opposite at the same time, which I think it's more sculptural, more acknowledging this act of sculpture. Does that make sense? Or just probably?
That's the first time that it enters a hard cover, right?
Yeah.
And with the ISBN number.
No, it's interesting that also the idea that it's memorializing something, which I guess is even more, more so in this book form.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked in fact about it, and we said like it has to be a hardcover. No,
No,
it's
no,
like
no,
somehow
no.
exactly like
Yeah.
to really kind of stress exactly what
It's a bit like when journals or newspapers get hardcovered in the library.
With this fantastic kind of red or bluish or greenish kind of fake leather. It was in fact also a direction we'd explored at the beginning.
Those big bound volumes, like, that are always in a kind of ugly color and
gold embossed, kind of New York Times.
I have a question about how do you distribute it, and so how do you roll it to the public, or how is it there or here? So
in a lot of different ways. I guess a lot by mail and by getting passed on, or art book fairs, or always for free. So far, so the book is the first time it's being sold.
The price
The price tag. And Yeah, in a way different forms. Sometimes in shows, so to take, but in an institution, and other times a combination of that and any other places that I can see that will be a more direct encounter with the public. And it also, it's also something that is more interesting when it's fresh.
Yeah.
So it seems like giving it out in like newspaper boxes or something like that only works when it's quite new. And then, because then it's already, these old editions are, they have a very strange kind of status, as you said.
I don't think it makes a difference. For me, it doesn't make a difference. I don't need them to be fresh.
No, but
Oh, no, yeah.
Yeah, but I was reading here 2021 October, and I was, oh wow. It's like fresh.
Yeah, but the political message is the half of this thing, the other is the linguistics and your interest in the language. And I think then it doesn't matter, is it a new item or is it an outdated one? And of course, I think, it was really interesting for me when we had the conversation. I also went through the back issues I had at home. It of course triggers a lot. I mean, at least for our generation who had fully lived that period very intensively. And so maybe for that reason it's equally interesting to read the old editions, I think, and also maybe understand how language has changed and how the word has changed. I think it tells a lot about that.
And to see also how much the certain patterns of mistake persist.
Yeah.
I mean,
as you said,
we've all, as much as things are corrected, and we all try to sort of retrain ourselves to decolonize our speech, make our speech less sexist. The things that are written quickly are still the kind of the layer below the one that we're trying to present to the world. And I say that for all of us, right? I don't say that it's like the bad liberal people who write those things, and then there are those of us who aren't guilty. So that's very, I think, interesting on a psychological and linguistic level. Just the persistence of those things, and it's not hopeless, because in each hopeless item there's like that little grain of hope of like, but this is what it should be. Even, this is what I said, but so it's that's why I find the whole thing kind of heartbreaking, because it's somehow the distance between what we mean and what we wished we meant, or what we say and what we wish we would think instead of what we actually are thinking, and that's none of us are really able to get out of that trap.
In psychoanalysis is very clear. We always say what we mean. Always. I think it's absolutely, there's no doubt. We always say what we mean. I mean, you say, actually I didn't mean that, that's allowed, because you actually meant it.
Yeah.
You wish you wouldn't want it.
Yeah.
You wish you don't mean it. But you always say what you mean. And you always hear what you want. So this is troubling in that case.
then you can confuse it with corrections.
Yeah. Or the different roles that we want to be.
Are there any questions or any
I
comments?
wanted to say something else, because I find it also interesting that you were said a couple times the word fact checking, that's something that has been big in the last years, gotten bigger. And I think that's something maybe, do you have a relationship to that, let's say, practice in journalism now that's got bigger in the sense of making a fact check about something that has misinformed explicitly and with the will to confuse people about something? Do you have a relationship to that kind of correcting, but in a from a third party? Okay. Shall I try to explain again? I don't know if you got what I was going to say.
Yeah, maybe try it.
Okay, so
fact-checking in the sense of like people that are like nowadays trying to correct misinformation that's being spread on social media, for example.
Yeah.
So they explicitly try to get to something and correct that, but it's a third party doing it. So it's not like the newspaper itself doing it. So it's like you're correcting something in the same sense that actual journalism used to do that in a newspaper before, but now it's coming from someone else. Like it's really the instance that has to do that from the outside to really make this correction, and it's a different thing.
Yeah. And very very current now, because I guess now there, you know, and the debate is kind of whether you want to give more bandwidth to something by correcting it. And I guess that's where it's hard to judge whether it makes sense to pull out a story from a possibly obscure source and even to correct it, because I guess what we've all learned in the meantime is that it doesn't help to correct it. You know, it doesn't make people trust the original source less. I mean, that we're also in a way ingrained in the sources new sources that we've chosen, that we're not likely to not trust a source just because it has misled us. So. But yeah, no, that's a huge thing now, because because the landscape is so much more fragmented, and there are so many reasons and so many things to try to address. So yeah, for sure.
I was really struck by in reading other editions was when you see it all together is this strange omniscient register they're always written in, and you sort of begin to wonder who is the we that's speaking, who is speaking here, this all-correcting godlike figure. It's not the journalist saying I made a mistake, it is just a mistake was made. And whether that had changed in the 20 years, or whether, like you mentioned at the start, that manipulation of language that is so specific to I hadn't noticed till I started reading
The passive voice and
this passive voice, and then it is also instilling an idea of truth again. That was a mistake. Now, however, I'm speaking the truth. And that in itself, of course, makes me certainly very suspicious. that kind of reinstigation of truth. And has that changed? Because it seems to me, just in my reading of corrections and clarifications, it's almost the last remaining bastion of the omniscient, godlike voice, in a way. There's still a mistake has been made.
Right, and it's often either the mistake was, you know, it's described in a passive way.
Yeah.
I guess you referred to that to Rezo's talking about the overuse of the conjunctive voice that seems to propose everything as a speculation, or that removes the responsibility for stating a fact and proposes it. Am I explaining it sort of?
No, it's correct. Yeah, Rezo said that he wishes more accountability. That meant not to say, you know, to put it in, like, how you say, not conjunctive, but what's actually the active verbs or something. Not to say, like, you know, it seems to me as if, but it is, like, you know, this godlike, he wants this godlike voice that you mentioned. And that was kind of interesting to see, like, you know, that someone from the younger generation actually misses this. And, you know, when I feel like, well, it's actually correct not to claim that you know when you don't know, it's actually kind of honest. But interestingly, that you say, you know, like these corrections could also be written like, you know, I've learned now from my colleague, or, you know, incoming email, I've learned that it's actually not like this, but it's actually, it might be like this, but maybe your readers want to double check it. Also,
But I
and
thought his
open
point-
up a bigger
sorry.
discussion, right?
Yeah. No, I thought his point was also that he wanted the writers to take more responsibility. That if they're right, and if they're wrong, they're wrong. But instead of proposing in this cognitive in a way that they can be right and wrong.
Yeah, it's a larger critique on the economy of publishing houses. I mean, it's like this is just a
Very small, yeah.
yeah, just a look of an excerpt of it. But yeah, it's still interesting. But I also thought, like, you know, you said that, you know, you read more of a psychoanalytic thing in that, like, you know, you say what you mean, or you can, or could read it like that. I think you could also read it like a big democratic laboratory. Like it just doesn't work as well as democracies do, but you can also read it through the lens of a current critique on representative democracy, that, you know, it's like so limited, and it's also like a promise into tomorrow. Oh, tomorrow we don't have to make these clarifications anymore because we notice now that we were unaware and we've been more aware, which, you know, never happens, of course, because there's also economic situations and hustle inscribed in making media. It would be so interesting to like see how it works in other media productions. I just remember you mentioned in media, right? And at the end, I mean, they were prohibited, not and you know, and also that there was this big discussion within in the media of, you know, what articles, like how would they deal with the editing practice, because it turned out that some articles had anti-Semitic content, right? Anti-Semitic content, and what to do with it. And they kind of found this way of like putting them at the very bottom somehow, so that you don't see it at once, but it's not gone. So everything stays online. And that's also an interesting practice. I don't know if I would agree with that, but it's, you know, it's problematic as well, but they try to kind of make it transparent that there are like all these different voices and that people are, you know, say racist things and not to cover it up. And actually I found it interesting to have this approach, not to be so over-censoring, but also. But then again, now that we have Breitbart and that, you know, do we actually want all this, you know?
Uncensored speech.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's maybe an unsolvable thing, and it's also I can also like see in your, and I like how you said this kind of sculptural, like, you know, that it also transports that, you know, how much transparency can we actually take, or do I want? And I think the we has to be out of this.
Yeah.
The obvious we.
Yeah.
How do I read it?
Any last comments, questions? Thank you all for your attention. And please get the text of Anna is printed. Well, each text is only printed in one language, and I am working on the English translation of Anna's text. So please get in touch with me if you would like it. And yeah, stay around and have a drink with us. Thank you.